So I'm going to talk about something called the Mobius loop behind it, but where this came from was trying to resolve some problems that we see at the moment. There are a lot of different frameworks on the market. Every day we have Scrum, we have Kanban, we have Lean Startup, Scrum at Sale, SAFe. Every day we seem to be getting more and more frameworks, which is adding to a lot of confusion. We have a lot of pressure on us, right? This need to adapt and to change and to do more. And so we get this big push on more and more, very much, I think, often output-based metrics. So we start saying, how many features did we deliver on time and on budget? How many points have been delivered? And it just feels like there's more and more complexity in the world. And that's a hard thing to deal with. And because of all that busyness taking all our time, we often forget to look at the outcomes that matter. Are we actually delivering what we can? And are we doing this in the simplest way, the quickest way possible? Because if we thought more features, more outputs were a good thing, I have a really great startup idea for you. And my startup idea is that I will get paid for extra buttons to go onto your remote control. Right? It's super killer. You can have more and more of these. So does anyone think that's a great idea? They want to sign up for my cool startup idea? Right. We hate more buttons. That actually, this next picture sums it up perfectly. So a guy went to visit his grandmother, and when he got there, she was getting up and changing the channel on the TV manually. And he said, well, why don't you use the remote? And she said, I don't know how to use it. It's too complicated. So he was obviously a very skilled usability expert because he fixed the problem. And I kind of feel like we could go back to work, look at our products and kind of tape up all the unnecessary stuff and get left with the essentials. So you need to remove the inessentials so the essential can speak. The more we add, there's a direct correlation to the less understandability and the less easy they are to use. So we talk about complexity all the time, but in a world that's getting increasingly complex, we actually need to be really disciplined about removing that complexity. We see things like design thinking. That's pretty popular at the moment. Who's using design thinking? Yeah, a lot of us, and if we're not, we're kind of curious about it. So this has a big push on, are we building the right thing? Do we understand our customers well? And then in Agile, we're all pretty familiar with that. There's a lot about, let's build it right, and whether this is a good thing or not, but we're going to try and build it fast. The left loop thinkers, they do good deep discovery, but the risk is if we don't validate our ideas, we're just doing this in theory, so we can get stuck in that analysis loop, right? Analysis paralysis. And our right loop thinkers, our agilists and the like, we can deliver a lot of features rapidly. Not that that's the point, but if that's all we do, we can just fail faster, right? That's all we're doing is speeding up fast failure. It's better than slow failure. I'm a big fan of fast failure, but I'd rather not fail. It'd be better if we actually had an idea about where we're going. So what we need is balance, and that's where the Mobius loop comes from. It's a pretty radically simple way of navigating to the outcomes that matter. So the idea of Mobius is to create a very simple structure that's highly adaptive. And it's something that's very agnostic. We want to be able to plug in frameworks and tools and be able to evolve without being prescribed one particular way. I mean, it seems to be at the moment, you know, a frenzy of mine's the best approach. I don't think that exists. When you find sort of more true agilists and lean people, they're more about understanding the problems, delivering the outcomes, and we have different ways we can do that. There might not be one best way. So how do we generate the right outcomes? So we're going to have Tim talk about what he's been doing with Red Hat Innovation Labs.
Cool. So I work in Red Hat Open Innovation Labs. I lead the labs here in EMEA. And the nature of our customer engagements, they're pretty short. They're typically 4 to 12 weeks. So I'm lucky. I get to sort of try lots of different practices out, different tools, and I get to build up stories. And I wanted to share 3 really great stories that are all about 3 awesome teams that I've worked with. And I've dug into my photo album to kind of bring us to life a little bit. So my first story comes from Dublin in Ireland, which is where I'm from, if you hadn't guessed. Fine people, even finer Guinness. It's not a stereotypical picture at all, is it? With a bunch of blokes with a pint of Guinness. So we were working for one of the big telcos there, and we were building a new buying portal in the enterprise business unit. And we used design thinking, which I thought was awesome. We were working with real end users, getting gold dust information and empathy mapping with them and scenario mapping with them. And this gave us a list of candidate features, a list of options that we could then start to think about implementing in our product backlog. And then after about 5 weeks of design thinking and building our backlog, we worked with Scrum, 2-week iterations. And we did these sprint reviews, these showcases every couple of weeks. Now this photo on the right was the Sprint 2 review. And I remember this because just after I took the photograph, this lady, just out of shot, got quite irate, quite angry about some huge big area of the solution that hadn't been thought about. And she was catching this, and she wasn't massively happy that no one had thought about this, but it was great feedback. And I thought, well, first of all, I thought I should stop taking photographs at that point. And I thought, well, this is really, if we weren't working in this iterative delivery, when would that have been caught? Probably many months later. But also, it actually triggered the need to do some more discovery, a whole new area of stakeholders we needed to do design thinking with. So it's back to that point. We really need a balance of continuous discovery and continuous delivery, and sometimes the delivery feeds the need for more discovery. My second story goes over to the Nordics about a year ago. Really awesome team here, working for one of the big automotives, one of the top 3 automotives in the world. And we were building a new application with the kind of car mechanics support tools area. Here we used impact mapping, really great practice to kick us off. We used a practice called event storming from domain-driven design, which basically allowed us to start to slice up the business processes into a microservices-oriented architecture. And that formed our product backlog of experiments we could start to run and features we could build. And now this team took more of a Kanban approach, so focused a bit more on continuous delivery and flow of feedback. Now the interesting thing here, this was working pretty well for us after about 4 or 5 weeks. But one of the senior stakeholders of the customer said to me, Tim, what's really worrying me is how do I bring all of this back to our organization? How do I prove to the executives that this is such a better way of working? Because those leaders only work with numbers and spreadsheets, and these sticky notes, I'm not sure they're going to believe it. And at that point, I thought, there's a practice I think would help us with this. It's called metrics-based process mapping, kind of from the family of value stream mapping. And super helpful in kind of quantifying the organizational outcomes before we'd been focused more on the business user outcomes. And really this showed that changes in context and motivations sometimes mean we have to drop the tools that we were using and pick up some new tools, all based on that feedback. My third story is just a couple of months ago. This is our Open Innovation Labs in London. We were working with a big defense company. Another amazingly awesome team. You just look at the T-shirts and the team identity there. This team used a lovely little tool called priority sliders. Got the conversation around alignment of relative priorities. And based on that conversation, we started to form some target outcomes, which we made very visible on the wall and were written in such a way that we could constantly assess and measure ourselves against. And then we started to slice out all of the work, all of the experiments we wanted to run, the research that we wanted to do, and we sliced it against those target outcomes that had come from the priority sliders and other practices. And that formed our product backlog. And again, this team worked in 1-week sprints using Scrum. And the interesting thing about this, we worked for them for 5 1-week sprints. And actually, this customer were less interested about building features on top of each other to have something that they could release, but were more interested in maximizing the learning. So actually, every delivery iteration was about running technical spikes and experiments so that they could maximize the learning to take back to their organization. So sometimes what we find is the knowledge and alignment gained in one practice is kind of building upon all of the shared understanding that was generated by previous practices, and they kind of connect together. How do those teams become awesome? I mean, the practices are good, and they're very helpful, but alone, can teams really become awesome? The thing that really makes teams awesome to me is its culture, okay? And it's where I focus 95+% of my energy on creating awesome culture. And Red Hat is an open source company. Red Hat is famous for Linux. A lot of people think of us as a Linux company, but we're actually an open organization. And what is an open organization? Well, it's about bringing open as the foundation of the culture of the that the teams work on. The characteristics of an open organization are transparency, inclusivity, adaptability, collaboration, and community. And really, these awesome characteristics, when you get them all in place in your foundation, they start to feed each other, and it starts to create this bubble of energy, this awesome foundation that when you use all of those other practices I talked about, they're much more effective. And that allows us to turn teams from this is a team that we met on day one, looking a bit sheepish and a bit nervous about what lies ahead, into this 6 weeks later. That's culture, yeah? That's awesome team culture, the Red Hat way, the open way. And of course, there's lots of practices to help us with culture as well. There's so many little tools and techniques to help put that psychological safety and culture in place. And also technical engineering culture, so important to drive continuous delivery at a sustainable place and not get bogged down by technical debt. So many practices, discovery practices, delivery practices, cultural practices, technology practices. Has anyone seen this? Yeah? So the guys at Deloitte, Chris Webb, came up with this a few years ago, and he kind of mapped all the frameworks and practices and tools onto the Tokyo subway system. And I find this fascinating. There's just so much out there to help. And Agile, it's supposed to be simple, isn't it? But whoa. And this was a few years ago, so it's probably doubled in size since. But really interesting graphic. Gabrielle introduced me to the Mobius loop, I think it was around about 2012, 2013. And I loved it. The reason I love it is because I can explain the journey, I can visualize a journey of any project, any product, any team, any program I've ever worked with on this simple navigator graphic. It's open source, so that's great. And we at Red Hat have both used and adopted the Mobius loop. And we've also contributed to it because it's very much community driven and it's evolved in the last 6, 7, 8 years. This is one of the many canvases which is openly available under Creative Commons, so it's free for you to use and free for it to use in your companies. It's one of several that you can find on the website. Let me take you through it. So when we approach an engagement in labs, we kind of rock up with a massive toolbox. We throw all of our tools out onto the floor or onto the table. And based on the context and our understanding of this customer, we think, well, what's the best tools for us to use? We don't have a prescribed method. We don't say we will always use this. We think, well, which of our tools are our favorite tools to use for this context? Now, we'll always have some tools that help us with the why. There's different tools that help with this, but helps us understand why are we here, what problems are we trying to solve, who are we trying to solve them for? And we've got little practices that help us drive that conversation. We always have practices that help us derive and align on target measurable outcomes. Again, different practices help with this. I've shown a few of them, we've got lots more. We always have practices that help us generate a list of options, those research experiments that we want to do, those spikes we want to do, those implementation features, the candidates, the options, and we have practices to help us apply economic prioritization to those. We always have practices that help us deliver. That might be Scrum, it might be Kanban, we don't care. It might even be Waterfall. Nothing says that might be the right tool for the job here. We always have practices that help us measure and learn from the increments of the products that come out of the delivery loop. Now, Red Hat took this open source model, and we thought, well, there's something that we want to build, we want to put this loop on to really make the teams awesome. And that was this foundation. Okay, and this is really, I think, what we're famous for, our open culture and our awesome use of technical practices. So again, we have tools that help us create an environment of psychological safety and awesome team cultures. And we have awesome technical practices that make use of containers and microservices and CI/CD and infrastructure as code and test automation. Again, different tools based on the context. And what we find when we build up this picture, we've got this lovely story, this visualization of how all of these practices connect together. I had a customer tell me recently, you know, I love all these practices, I get them one by one. What I'm struggling to remember is what do I use when, and how do they fit together, and how does one build on top of the other? Well, this is a great navigator and visualization that helps drive those conversations and shared understanding. So a lot of our engagements, our residencies are building up a visualization. We call it the practice corner because it tends to sit in the corner of the room. It works in other parts of the room as well, but we tend to have it in the corner. So this was one at Heritage Bank in Australia. This is an awesome picture of all of the practices in action and the artifacts being used, and then a little QR code that takes you into our open practice library, which tells you all about what the practice is and how it's used. So this is starting to be used really widely. It's gone as far as New Zealand, last week in China and Korea. We're kind of using it as a real talking point and a navigator for how we balance continuous discovery, continuous delivery, and we put that on a foundation of culture, collaboration, and technical engineering practices. So that's how we use the Mobius loop at Red Hat, and how we've adopted the open source aspects of it and done some remixing. Wrap up.
Yep. So just taking you quickly back to show the framing with what we did with the coffee earlier. What was really interesting is a lot of people do the equivalent of starting in options. I think a lot of us here are used to the right loop where we're doing Scrum, Kanban, all these kind of practices, and they often start with create a backlog, which I think lives in that middle part. So we did the equivalent. You know, when you get a customer who says, let's build a CRM. It's the equivalent of let's have a coffee. And because we haven't understood the why, we actually create a lot of complexity. We iterate around the right loop many times. It's quite a wasteful way of delivering because we come up with many features, throw them out, and hope some of them will work. And we throw away a lot in the meantime, or even worse, we don't throw it away. So we end up with a lot of stuff we have to maintain. So when we use this, it just reminds people where they are. I get some people saying, oh, look, we're too much in the left loop. We haven't tested our ideas. We're too much in the right loop. So if we use coffee, right? If I said to you, well, why do you want the coffee this morning? Some people might say, well, I want to wake up. Other people might say, well, it's a ritual. But when we dig down, there's a lot more to it. When you're at a new place, it'll turn out to be around comfort, having something that's comfortable and safe for you. It brings up all these good feelings. If we say it's to stay awake, we would say, well, why do you want to be awake, right? I would quite like to be able to sleep at a conference. Sometimes I do. So if we then say, well, hang on, if we really understand the outcomes, which could be to learn or to network or to relax, you can then create a lot of different options. I deliberately use the word options. I don't like requirements, all these backlogs and things. It tends to tell us we have to deliver. To me, these are a big list of guesses, stuff that we think might help deliver the outcomes, but until we actually test it, we don't know. So what we want to do is keep this continuous flow and balance it up. So if I said to you, well, if you wanted to have your coffee to wake up so you could learn, I bet you could think of many different ways to learn. Coffee's just one very small piece of it. And what we're looking for is the easiest, lowest cost things that deliver the biggest bang for our buck, really, the most outcome. And the only way we know that is to continuously test. So what I found really interesting, it's a very simple pattern. A lot of us come from the world of Lean. We're going to recognize this pattern that we use. And we've been finding people adopting it for many different things. So you're hearing about Red Hat, visualizing with all these different maps. being able to create your own journeys as you go, and that's pretty important. I find, depending on the context, I'm using it in very, very different ways. If we look at here, this is Red Hat and Google are using it for their client engagements. We even have one of our guys using it for social impact in Pakistan, and he's just gone into a war zone with Mobius in Yemen, which is pretty cool, right? So his idea is to help people be able to improve their lives using this kind of approach. So now when we go in, transformation, scaling, they're the big things. And people say to me, the equivalent of jumping into solutions, they say, we want to be agile, right? We want an agile transformation. And I always say, okay, great. But what problems are we trying to solve? If we solve them, what will be different? Otherwise, you've probably dropped a couple of million on expensive consultants. You might be really agile, and I think the earlier talk, but Mick, he actually brought this up, that we can be doing a lot of agile, passing our Nokia tests, I remember that from the day, and actually we haven't actually delivered anything of value because we didn't understand the problems and we're not using that to track. Okay? So again, as Tim said, all open source up on the website. I think we've probably got time for one question. Yeah? Anybody got a question? Down the back.
Yeah, so my question is, there's also a practice within design thinking called the double diamond, where you start figuring out what is the problem, what is the solution, how do you deliver the solution, and what's the difference between Mobius and design thinking?
Yeah, I think it's a common thinking pattern. I worked a lot with design thinking. So what I find is that the design thinkers think that's to just think about design thinking itself. What it's not connected to is the delivery. So we want to go all the way through from strategy to delivery. It's the same concepts. I completely agree. It's all about understanding problems, human behavior. What we're trying to do is bring together the pieces of design thinking and agile, so we get the rapid validation techniques more connected. Also, you know, we encompass a lot of things, not just design thinking at the moment. You know, you have people doing Lean UX, you have people doing business model generation. So again, it's about take the practices that work for you, put them together. So that was the thinking behind it. Any other questions? Otherwise, that coffee subliminal, we all want coffee. Okay, thank you.